Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hi, listeners. It's Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, climate and agriculture. Michael Grunwald is a journalist and award-winning author with a provocative new book entitled We Are Eating the Earth. He joins Dr. Josh Sharfstein to talk in his own blunt style about the challenge of feeding the planet without wiping out the wetlands, forests, and other carbon reservoirs that protect us from global warming. Let's listen.
Mike Grunwald, thank you so much for joining me today on Public Health on Call to talk about your book, We Are Eating the Earth. This is not the usual book on climate change that is going to focus on energy. This book is all about food and whether or not our way of making food is sustainable for our planet. And it was fascinating to read because I thought initially that when people talk about climate, they're usually talking about energy. They're talking about getting rid of fossil fuels. But you're talking about food. Why is that?
Well, thanks so much for having me, Josh. And honestly, I felt the same way. I was a reporter at the Washington Post, at Time Magazine, at Politico Magazine, and I wrote a lot about energy and climate. And I realized I was spectacularly ignorant about the food part of the problem. But food is a third of the problem, and it's about 1% of the conversation and 3% of the money. So I'm hoping we can start to grapple with this stuff.
So lay out the argument. If I'm very devoted to electrifying the economy, switching out of fossil fuels, how do you get my attention to say it might actually be what we're all eating that is a huge part of the problem we have to solve?
Well, it's true. Energy is still 2/3 of the problem, right? But the good news is at least we know what to do about energy. You got to electrify the global economy and start using clean electricity to run it. And we are actually starting to do that a little bit. And if you're building a power plant today, it's probably wind or solar. Food, on the other hand, we don't know what to do and the problem's getting worse. And the basic problem is that we're eating the earth, right? I mean, yes, we have diesel tractors and crop dusters have some carbon emissions. The burping cows have some methane emissions. Fertilizer has some nitrous oxide emissions. But the main problem is that our agriculture now takes 2 of every 5 acres of land on the planet, and it is displacing nature. And every time we tear down forests, we are losing all the carbon in the forest, and it's going in the sky, and we're losing that forest's ability to soak up carbon in the future. Right now, our terrestrial land sink is soaking up about 1/4 of our carbon emissions. And so we are losing a soccer field worth of tropical forest every 6 seconds. And that is straight emissions. That is a climate catastrophe, and we can't keep doing it.
And the challenge of food keeps getting harder, especially as the population grows.
That's right. We're heading towards 10 billion people. By 2050, we're going to need about 50% more food. We're going to need about 70% more meat. And meat turns out to be a real problem because basically part of meat, and particularly ruminant meat, those animals take up an awful lot of land. 2/3 of our agricultural land is pastures, and 3/4 of our agricultural land is used to feed livestock. And so this is a problem. What we're doing now is not sustainable, and we're going to have to figure out ways to turn it around.
One of the most interesting themes of your book is that you can't just look at what's happening on a particular acre of cropland to figure out whether it's good or bad for the environment, because it's the big picture, whether or not agriculture is taking over these other habitats, wetlands, forests. It's that big picture that really makes a huge difference for the planet. And I thought you illustrated this really well with the discussion of ethanol and other biofuels.
Sure. I mean, the main character of my book, a guy named Tim Searchinger, he started out as a wetlands lawyer, and he didn't like the idea of that if we have a lot of ethanol in the Midwest, they're probably going to just roll over the rest of the few wetlands left in the middle of this country. But he started to think about it because everybody was talking about biofuels as this great climate solution. And the idea was basically that, when you grow corn, it soaks up carbon. I mean, his feeling was like, wait a minute, those cornfields were already soaking up carbon before we were using them for fuel. And if now we're going to divert that food to fuel, then we're going to have to create more acreage of cornfields to replace the food. And that's not going to come out of a parking lot. It's going to be wetlands or forests. And that's going to have climate implications of its own. And when you look at the larger picture, we now use about a Texas worth of land to grow biofuels. And that land used to grow food and it needs to be replaced. So do we need an entire Texas worth of land to replace the food? Maybe not, but we need a lot of land, and that has a huge climate impact. Unlike energy, where it turns out we have alternatives to fossil fuels, we don't have alternatives to land to growing food. We need it. That's what it does really well. So it can grow food or it can store carbon. And if you use it to grow fuel, you're going to need some land somewhere else to do the things that we need land to do.
And so another implication of this argument is that growing less food per acre, given how many people we need to feed, will create problems for the environment.
That's right. And that's where I start to get into trouble with people, right? Because Michael Pollan has written beautifully about these kind of throwback, more natural, more rustic farms that have more diverse crops, and they don't use as many of these evil fertilizers and pesticides, and they're not monocultures, and the animals have names instead of numbers. And that's great, but it turns out that the real environmental disaster of agriculture is not so much the intensification of those Michael Pollan-ish farms into more industrial farms, although there is an environmental cost to that, but it's the transformation of nature into agriculture in the first place. And if those smaller, nicer, kinder and gentler farms grow much less food, then you're going to need much more acreage to grow the same amount of food. And that's the problem, because that's the Amazon. And we don't see it so much in the United States because we already deforested our Amazon, right? Indiana used to be 85% forest, and now it's all corn and soybeans. So we don't think of this ongoing environmental destruction. But the fact is, when you use land for agriculture, it can't be used for nature anymore. And there's a cost to that.
So let's talk about solutions that don't necessarily require using a lot more land. One of them could be changing our diets. What would be the kind of dietary changes that would have an impact? And then tell me whether you think they're realistic.
Well, it's funny. The best is going vegan. And if your listeners are vegan, I salute them. That's awesome, because a sort of purely plant-based diet is eating plants rather than running plants through an animal is by far the most efficient and best for the planet. And that's great. It's interesting. Going vegetarian is also great. I just cut out beef and lamb. And it turns out that's about as good as going vegetarian, because vegetarians tend to eat more dairy. And it turns out that the problem is really cows. Cows are extraordinarily inefficient converters of their feed into our food. It takes about 25 calories worth of feed for a cow to create 1 calorie of beef for us. And that's really the problem, right? It's just all that energy that goes into growing their hooves and their hides and their tails and their breathing and their pooping and their burping that does not create food for us turns out to be inefficient. And so, yes, if we could eat less beef, that would be awesome. It's just that beef is delicious is kind of a problem.
Right. So you don't turn the book into a call for veganism. Why is that?
I don't, because partly, look, the vegan activists have been yelling at us for years to, meat is murder, stop eating meat. And meat consumption has gone up every year. Maybe we're not moral enough. It's not that we're not educated enough. We just, over the last 2 million years, we really seem to have a taste for meat.
What about alternative proteins like Impossible Burgers that are aiming to replace beef consumption? Are you more optimistic about their potential to make a difference?
So I am optimistic about the future of these alternative proteins that can provide, hopefully, the meat experience, that tastes as good and is as inexpensive as meat. We haven't gotten there yet. In my opinion, and I think in consumers' opinion, so far Beyond Meat didn't do it. They were providing an inferior product at a higher price, and lo and behold, people didn't keep eating it. But I think with a lot of research, a lot of hopefully some government money, the kind that we put into research of solar and wind and electric vehicles and batteries, I have a lot of hope for not only plant-based meat, but the kind of lab-grown or cultivated meat grown from animal cells, because ultimately it is more efficient. You can certainly imagine that if you just grow meat in a brewery and you're not growing, the feathers and the beaks and the clucking and the pooping, that you can imagine doing that more efficiently and ultimately cheaper than growing meat. But of course, meat has a big head start. It has a lot of loyal consumers, so it's going to be hard.
Let me ask you about other ways to increase the productivity of the land that we have now. That takes up a big part of the second part of your book, where you're saying, okay, we have this huge challenge. You talk about the challenge as we have to feed more people while protecting the climate, which means preserving land as wetlands and estuaries and forests wherever possible. One approach you write about is reducing food waste, which spares us from needing more acres for agriculture. But I'd like to ask you about another solution in your book, increasing yield. What are the kinds of things that can happen to increase the yield of every acre that's put to agriculture?
Well, again, it's going to be hard, but we've done it in the past, right? This was the Green Revolution. And a lot of people are unhappy with the Green Revolution because fertilizers are creating a dead zone the size of Connecticut in the Gulf of Mexico. And some people don't like GMOs, and people don't like toxic pesticides, big irrigation projects, not always popular, factory farms that kind of herd animals together, certainly make meat more efficiently than we used to. And generally, we've tripled crop and livestock yields over the last 60 years. And that means that we're using a third as much land to grow all the food that we have than we would otherwise. And that's why all the people who said we were heading for perpetual famines during the 70s and 80s, they were wrong. It turns out that we were able to grow all this stuff. But we haven't stopped deforestation. We've only reduced it. So we're going to need an even greener green revolution, hopefully one that makes less of a mess. It's probably going to be more biological than chemical. And you do see these biological alternatives to fertilizers and pesticides. We already have fertilizer in most of the world. We already have large-scale irrigation. So we can't just expand that. We've already done that. We're going to need gene editing to produce these drought-tolerant and higher yield crops. There are guys at the University of Illinois who are using supercomputers and artificial intelligence and the genomics to try to reinvent photosynthesis to make it more efficient. And they think they can increase crop yields 50%. There's a lot that smart people are working on. But again, it's going to be hard.
It could even mean finding ways to raise cattle on less land.
Yeah, that's right. I went to Brazil, and it was very interesting because you have tons of these incredibly degraded ranches, and you have like one cow for 5 acres, and it's just a terribly inefficient use of Amazon, basically. And then you see other places in the Amazon where they've, without that much work, they fertilize the pastures, they grow higher yield grasses. Sometimes they have these feedlots that some people aren't going to like, but they use rotational grazing and some regenerative practices that Michael Pollan would like. And what you see is some incredible yields. They sometimes 10, 12 times higher. And that means they're using 1/10, 1/12 as much of the Amazon. So I think beef is really a classic example because it's like the Willie Sutton thing, right? Like he robbed banks because that's where the money is. If you want to go after emissions, you have to go after beef because that's where the emissions are.
Something that kind of floats out of your book is the challenge of doing this because of politics. And you've touched on some of these themes along the way. Biofuels may actually make the climate problem worse, but they are very popular. And the book chronicles all kinds of fights over ethanol and other biofuels where all the evidence in the world didn't make that much of a difference because people were really excited to get subsidies for ethanol. And in a different part of the political world, you're saying some things that are going to rankle people who are opposed to using genetic techniques, I should say, to improve crop yields, or people who believe the solution is to farm less intensely. There's a great story, I think, here about the farming of pigs in Denmark and the fact that the logic of your book and the argument is that it's good to get as many pigs per acre as you can because that's going to spare other acres. But activists really had a goal of reducing the number of pigs per acre because they thought that there were too many.
Right.
And so how do you navigate all of these different political channels in order to address the climate and food challenges ahead?
Well, again, first thing is it's hard, right? In the United States, we have, 1% of us are farmers. But when it comes to farm policy and food policy, that 1% has way more SWAT than the other 99% of us. And that seems to be true in a lot of places. I'm glad you mentioned Denmark, though, right? Because I try not to be too Debbie Downer. And in Denmark, I think you have to start with the idea that they were really committed to climate action and doing something about climate. And they were incredibly successful on the energy side. So successful that basically they were looking at it like, we've mostly solved our energy problem. Now farms are going to be half of our emissions and they're only a few percent of our economy. And suddenly the farmers are like, uh-oh, I guess we got to come to the table because they had a big target on their head. And the fact is, Denmark has done a model policy where they're going to be taxing emissions, which is, of course, efficient. They're going to use a lot of the money to invest in research, to climate smart agricultural techniques and higher yielding techniques that are going to allow Denmark to produce even more food with even less land. Then they're going to rewild 1 million acres of their farmland to return it to forest and wetlands. And at the same time, they're having a nationwide effort to really promote plant-forward eating and alternative protein. So they're doing all the things. And I think that's how we have to think about it. It will be very difficult because in the United States, agriculture is highly subsidized. It's a really good deal for the status quo. So I'm not trying to understate how difficult it is to move this battleship around. But again, like the world gives $600 billion worth of subsidies to farmers every year. And I don't think it's totally unrealistic that in the future, that money can at least be, there can be some strings attached to, we want you to do your thing. We want you to make even more food, but we want you to make less of a mess. And here are some of the ways you can do it.
Mike Grunwald, your book is We Are Eating the Earth. I hope people really dig into it and get exposed to your argument and, like me, start to think about the world a little bit differently. Thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me, Josh, and thanks for all your good work.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.